Hi folks, Professor I here again. I welcome you to the week 3 video. Hope that you're doing well so far with all your classes and other responsibilities that are going on. I want to first give you a quick little overview of what's happening in our class this week and then direct you to the Doing What Comes Naturally sheet. And you can kind of follow along with me there. So we do have our quiz, our very first one on Unit 1, Realism and Local Color this week. And to take that quiz, you will go to the Quizzes tab, which is found up at the top of our Brightspace course page. You'll click on that, and then you'll click on Quiz 1. And so before you take the quiz, you want to make sure that you have watched my videos up to that point, that you've looked at the documents, actually read the readings that you were supposed to read, and that you've engaged in those discussion board activities, because if you have not done that, then obviously you probably won't do as well on that quiz. So that's something you definitely want to do. And then the other task for this week are to read that excerpt from Stephen Crane's War is Kind. And it's found in our textbook. You can also find War is Kind by doing a Google search, but this is obviously not the entire poem, because it's a very, very long poem, and we're only doing just a little excerpt from it. And that's why, even though the title, as you'll see on the syllabus, is a poem title, and usually poem titles are placed in quotation marks, but this one's italicized because it's a super, super long poem. And we're just doing a little short excerpt from it. And so then obviously you want to read the sheet that you can follow along with me here as I'm doing the video. The Doing What Comes Naturally, Defining and Understanding Naturalism in American Lit sheet. And then we have a week 3 discussion board. And there's just one topic this week, and that's digging deeper into War is Kind. So that's this week's task. So if you want to pull up this Doing What Comes Naturally sheet and follow along with me, you can go to Content up at the top of our course page, and then to Course Documents, and then you would click on this sheet. So we've talked a little bit about naturalism already. We've compared it to Romanticism, which came before our study of American literature, and to realism, which happened, right at the beginning of our time period that we're studying, 1865, right at the end of the Civil War. And now we're looking at naturalism a little more closely. So its origins actually were originally European, but naturalism refers also to a very important movement in American literature from the 1890s until the 1920s. So if I ever ask you on a quiz, when did naturalism really take place? What's the time period for naturalism? That would be your answer, from the 1890s until the 1920s. And so it's associated with realism because it shares an emphasis on depicting reality as it really is, and not, sugarcoating it. Naturalism is more than a literary technique, and this is something that you may be asked on a quiz. So it's more than just a technique, because it involves the philosophy of determinism. So this idea that many things in life are predetermined for us, whether we like it or not, determinism. So it is anti-romantic. Ooh, naturalism does not like romanticism. It is like the antithesis of romanticism. So this says its writers believe in the limited ability of humans to impose their own will upon their destinies. And this is taken from a departmental sheet. But actually, naturalist writers almost believe that humans have almost no ability to impose their own will. And so naturalist writers did not appreciate the imagination's embellishment of reality at all. They were much more extreme than the realists. So for the naturalist, furthermore, it was the duty of the writer to present to the reader reality without any illusion whatsoever, right? Just nothing. Just to give it to you straight. And there's just a scientific, almost detached, cold view of reality with naturalism, rather than adorning or misleading or pleasing the reader. So it's not meant to be entertaining writing. It's just the hard, cold truth, bitter and harsh as it is. And the writer is seen in naturalism to have a diagnostic function. So it's the duty of the writer to scrutinize the ills of society, right? And to say, hey, society, you're all messed up. And look what happens to people when you treat them the way that you do. And so a lot of the naturalist writers would actually bring national attention, to horrible situations like the plight of the poor and things of that nature, because they felt that they had a duty to scrutinize the ills of society and to bring those ills to light. And then the scientific part of naturalism, sort of that detached scientific coldness of it. And you'll hear that kind of detached voice in Crane's War is Kind when you read it. That part of it has its origins in the theories of Darwin. So remember Charles Darwin and survival of the fittest, and also after Karl Marx and the development of the social sciences during the 19th century. So the emergence of all of those kinds of ideas corresponds with the emergence of naturalism. So American naturalist writers sort of developed in two different ways. And so one of those schools of writers really looked at the social and political dynamics of American urban life. So remember how we said that the realists looked at the middle class, just the average Joe? So the naturalists were looking at urban life, city life. What is life like in the 1890s through the 1920s in the big cities in America, where we have lots of poor people now, we have lots of immigrants coming in, we have these urban conditions that are really difficult. And then the other direction examined the biological aspects of deterministic thought. So what happens when you and I are placed in a situation where it's life and death? And the naturalist would say, here's what's going to happen. All of those animal tendencies for survival that Darwin talks about, survival of the fittest, are going to emerge in us. And all of our morals are just going to go out the window, and we're just going to act like animals. So you can see that they just had a great view of the world there. And so the influence of Karl Marx is really evident in that first branch that examines social and political dynamics. And the influence of Charles Darwin is evident in the biological aspects, the survival of the fittest kind of idea. So that diagnostic element of naturalism really derives directly from the French novelist Émile Zola, and I won't ever ask you that on a quiz, but I do want you to be aware of that. And so Crane really endorsed that kind of view. It's the writer's job to analyze. And so he had a very famous novel in 1893 called Maggie, a Girl of the Streets. And so he shows that, and this is a quote, environment is a tremendous thing in the world and frequently shapes lives regardless. So that naturalistic idea that, you know, hey, I may be a great person, I may have lots of optimistic ideas about life, and I may believe in myself and just, you know, all of that and have a lot of willpower, but if I'm born poor in the big city and I don't have a chance in the world to succeed and everything's working against me, well, too bad. That's just the way it is, right? So that environment is going to shape me regardless of anything else. That's that naturalistic view coming out. So that novel, Maggie, presented the process of the disruption of Maggie's family, her descent into prostitution because of their poverty, and her eventual suicide. And it considers this process as an inevitable consequence of the limited choices that were offered to her by the poverty of that New York environment that she was born into through no fault of her own. So it's a very dark sort of way of looking at the world. And Maggie really is a great example of American naturalism because it's got the use of the urban setting. It refuses, this is another characteristic of naturalistic writing, It will refuse to condemn Maggie for being a prostitute or to overly sentimentalize her. It's again that sort of scientific detached view, just here's the way it is, friends, whether you like it or not, right? So there's not a lot of gushy-mushy sentimentality in it, poor Maggie. And by the same token, there's not, oh, you awful terrible person, you, how could you be a prostitute? And so it has a very objective focus, naturalistic writing, on subjects that might have seemed scandalous or immoral, particularly in those days. So the supposedly immoral nature of naturalism in American writing shouldn't be underestimated because, believe it or not, in France at the time, they thought that our writing, our naturalistic writing, was scandalous and liable to censorship or prohibition in France. And usually it would have been just the opposite. So Crane later in his career moved away from classic naturalism, but his work always maintained that sort of diagnostic, anti-illusionist kind of element. Another wonderful book that he wrote was Red Badge of Courage, about a Civil War soldier. And it's one of my favorites. He did not live in the Civil War. He lived after that. But you would not know it to read that work. I mean, it is very realistic and amazing. So, we see that emphasis on how economic social forces determine human behavior in the work of people like Howells and Norris and Dreiser. And we see elements of naturalism in Sinclair and Steinbeck. And I've listed a few works there. I won't ask you any of that on a quiz. But here's what you do need to understand for a quiz. Naturalistic writing is closely linked to American social change during a period of dramatic capitalist growth and the rise of big business. So if I were to ask you on a quiz, what brought forth naturalism? What caused it? You could say social change, the rise of capitalism, the rise of big business. Lots of people, again, as with realism, moving from the country into the big city, rising immigration, same with realism. All of those constant forces, and then social Darwinism. So, again, the ideas of Marx and Darwin coming into play formed an important part of naturalism at the end of the 19th century. So how do certain individual American writers kind of explore that concern with biological forces? So that deterministic concern with biological forces is less evident actually in American writing than elsewhere. But it does emerge, ironically enough, you might not think so, but in the 1890s novels of good old Mark Twain, and especially Pudd'nhead Wilson, if you can imagine. If you look at Pudd'nhead Wilson with new eyes, you can see it. And in a lot of writing by women writers at the time. And so Kate Chopin, we read her work, Desiree's Baby, explored a lot of naturalistic ideas, and particularly in her book, The Awakening, which she published in 1899. And so the heroine of the novel, if you will, the protagonist, is Edna Pontellier. And Edna Pontellier just kind of doesn't want to fit into the typical mold of a woman at the time. She really doesn't want to be married. She really doesn't want to be a mom. She's not the mom type. And she struggles. She just wants to be independent and free. And so Dr. Mandelay, who is one of the characters in this piece, tells Edna that romantic love, now here's a real naturalist idea for you, is actually an illusion. It's not even a real thing. It's an illusion. It's damaging to women's social status, he says, since it determines for them the biological role of motherhood. So what he's basically saying is, ladies, all these wonderful romantic desires you feel, it's just your hormones. It's just nature pushing you to keep the species moving forward and reproduce. That's all it is. It's not even real. Sorry, ladies, right? And so again, that really dark sort of naturalistic view. And so Edna maintains kind of a romantic view of experience, and she commits suicide at the end of this work. And in contrast to Maggie, when Maggie commits suicide, with Edna, it's like this triumphant expression of individual will over circumstance. So Edna says to herself, dead gummit, okay, so I'm just not cut out to be a wife, and I'm not cut out to be a mother, and I want to be independent, and society won't let me, so I'll just show society. I'll walk right into this ocean and just drown myself, so there. Right? Well, there's only one trouble, one problem there. You're dead. Gosh, I hate when that happens, don't you? So that's, hate that I sort of gave it away there for you if you're going to read The Awakening, but that's The Awakening. If you ever read any of Jack London's work, so he was really exploring the Darwinian part of naturalism. So this idea of how if you and I get into certain situations, the naturalist would believe that otherwise buried animalistic survival instincts are going to surface. So if we get stranded out on a desert island, heck, we could just all turn into cannibals just like that, because that's just how we are. Life isn't pretty. And so that very dark naturalistic view, and that was frequently a theme in London stories. I won't ask you that on a quiz, but those are good examples to sort of show you how naturalism worked. So has naturalism continued on into modern American literature? So literature that we're continuing to see. Well, it was most influential like 1890 to 1920s, but aspects of it survived into modernism. So if I ask you that on a quiz or on a midterm or on a final, that's the answer. You'll notice that a lot of the important parts here that you need to remember are often italicized or emboldened. And so aspects of naturalism did survive into modernism, and so we see it in Hemingway's early work. If any of you ever had me when we were studying Hills Like White Elephants, you'll see it there. And it often uses that naturalistic idea of the individual who's being tested by some sort of extreme circumstance and learning to live without self-delusion. So that's just a good overview for you of naturalism. And so looking ahead to next week, we have another quiz, this time on naturalism and Crane. And by the way, a lot of these things don't open for you until that Monday of whatever week we're about to enter at about 8 o'clock a.m. And it's designed that way on purpose. But you'll take that quiz. You'll want to make sure that you've studied, listen to these videos, studied the accompanying documents, and participated in the discussion board activities to do well on the quizzes. Next week, we'll be starting our third unit on African American lit of the late 19th, early 20th century. So still the same time period as naturalism, but this time we're looking at African American writers of that period. And we have a beautiful piece, The Wife of His Youth by Charles Chestnut. And we'll have an overview of the writers of that time. And then we're looking at the Atlanta Exposition Address by Booker T. Washington, and Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others by W.E.B. Du Bois. And so these were two great African-American leaders of the time, but they disagreed on how to best approach the issues of the day. And there's a little poem by Dudley Randall for next week, Booker T. and W.E.B., that just really offers very succinctly the ideas of both men. So we'll have a little video about all of that. And you'll have two topics in your week 4 discussion board, one of them involving the wife of his youth, and the other will be a debate between Booker T versus W.E.B. And we'll see which man's ideas you feel like might have been the most effective at the time. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your week, guys.